Welcome back. I've been sitting with this particular script for several days, and what separates it from the hundreds of betrayal stories in circulation is the silence of the response. No confrontation in a doorway, no dramatic exit. What this man does instead is methodical, built on estate law and financial forensics so precisely executed that by the time his wife understood the scope of what had already happened, every document had been filed and every asset had been moved beyond her reach. Right here on his eternal diary.
The first thing Ethan Calloway noticed was the cologne on his daughter's hair. Not perfume. Not the vanilla-scented shampoo he bought her every month from the pharmacy on Weston Street, the one with the cartoon rabbit on the bottle that Lily insisted upon because it matched her bedroom curtains. This was something deeper, woodsy, expensive, percus with a top note of cedar and something synthetic underneath. That arrived in a black glass bottle and cost more than it should have, and announced itself without apology, in the way that certain men believed they could announce themselves without apology. He held Lily against his chest in the entryway of their house, her small arms hooked around his neck, her sneakers still pressing against his thighs where she'd launched herself at him the moment he'd come through the door. And he breathed in, boom, slowly, once. Cedar. And something deliberate underneath it. Marcus Dre wore that cologne. Ethan had bought it for him once, 4 years ago, for Marcus's birthday, a rectangular black bottle from a boutique fragrance house on the upper end of the city, ordered because Ethan had been the kind of friend who paid attention, the kind who remembered that Marcus's father had worn cedar-based fragrances every day of his working life, and that Marcus, as despite the polished exterior and the practiced ease with which he occupied expensive rooms, still searched for his father in small and quiet ways. It had been a gesture born from genuine attention. That was what made it land. He set Lily down on the hallway floor and watched her run toward the kitchen, already demanding juice, her pink backpack bouncing against her small spine, and he stood there in the entryway without moving. The house smelled like dinner. Yet Serena had made something with garlic and rosemary, a smell that should have been domestic and settling, the smell of a life organized around warmth. The lights in the living room were on, their usual evening temperature, amber and steady. The television produced a low, unremarkable murmur from the direction of the couch. Some cooking program Serena watched on Tuesday evenings because she found it meditative, she'd said once, the rhythm of preparation, the way things came together from parts, and everything looked as it should. Ethan took off his coat. He hung it on the hook by the door with the same two-handed motion he'd used 10,000 times in this entryway. He set his briefcase down on the floor to the left of the hook, precisely where he always set it. He loosened his tie with 2 fingers, methodically, without urgency. Then he walked into the kitchen, kissed Serena on the cheek, and said nothing about the cologne. He was not a man who spoke before he understood. And he did not yet understand, not fully, not in the complete, documented, irrefutable way that a man with his professional formation required before he acted. He had suspicions. He had patterns. He had the forensic accountant's instilled reflex for identifying anomalies in data that presented itself as ordinary. But he didn't have the complete picture. And Ethan Calloway had always believed, yet with a discipline that had served him through 15 years of uncovering other people's carefully concealed truths, that incomplete pictures were more dangerous than no picture at all. You acted on fragments, you made noise prematurely, and then you lost the leverage. You gave the other side time to prepare, to move things, to construct alternative explanations. You handed them the gift of your own impatience. He would not lose the leverage. Serena was talking. She moved through the kitchen with the ease of a woman who felt fully unobserved, describing a gallery opening she wanted to attend next weekend, a brand partnership inquiry that had arrived by email that afternoon, something about Lily's teacher sending home a note regarding a new enrichment program. She talked with the fluid ease of a woman comfortable in her own architecture, and Ethan responded at the appropriate intervals, asking the appropriate follow-up questions. It wearing the face of a husband interested in the details of his wife's week. It cost him nothing. He had always been very good at being present and absent simultaneously, at occupying a space fully while directing his actual attention elsewhere. It was, he'd once thought, a professional quality. Standing in his kitchen on a Tuesday evening watching Serena stir something on the stove, he recognized that he'd been doing it in his marriage for at least 2 years. How was Lily's playdate?" he asked. "Good." She didn't turn around. "She had fun at Chloe's." Ethan opened the refrigerator, took out the water filter, poured himself a glass. "She seemed tired when I picked her up. More than usual. They played outside all afternoon. You know how she gets when she's been running. She crashes hard." He nodded. Right. He drank the water slowly. He replaced the filter. He went to Lily's room to read her a story. She demanded 2. As she always demanded 2, she'd been demanding 2 since she turned 4, and discovered that 1 was a number an adult could be talked into doubling if you framed the request correctly, and Ethan had been accommodating her negotiating instinct ever since because he found it admirable in a 6-year-old. He sat on the edge of her bed with the books she chose from the shelf. Tonight, a story about a girl who found a river that ran uphill, and a story about 2 mice who disagreed about the color of the moon. And he read with his full attention, doing the different voices she expected, watching her small face track every sentence. Her eyelids grew heavy over the second story. It was when she was nearly asleep, in that specific border territory between consciousness and dreaming that children inhabited with so little apparent concern, that she said it. Not to him. To her stuffed elephant, positioned in the crook of her arm with the seriousness she afforded things she considered essential. She murmured it in the half-conscious way children murmured when they were processing the day, sorting it, filing it, a small, certain voice that carried no weight of performance because there was no performance left to perform. "Dad said he'd take me to the zoo." Ethan stopped breathing. He sat very still on the edge of her bed. "What did you say, sweetheart?" She didn't answer. She was asleep. He sat on the edge of her bed for 4 more minutes. He counted them on the clock above her dresser, the one shaped like a sun that he'd picked out with her at a home goods store, which she had chosen because it was yellow, and yellow was currently her favorite color, though she'd been indicating for the past few weeks that green might be making a move. 4 minutes on the sun clock. Then he turned off her lamp, stood up, and walked into the hallway with the deliberate quietness of a man who had learned that emotion was most useful when it was delayed. From the living room, Serena laughed softly at something on the television. Ethan went to his home office. He closed the door. He sat at his desk in the dark. He was not shocked. What he understood, in the precise and comprehensive way he understood things that had been building for a long time, was that this was not a beginning. It was a completion, a final line in a ledger that had been accumulating entries for months. The kind of moment that retroactively organized everything that had come before it into a pattern that had always been there, yet waiting for the one piece of evidence that made it undeniable. What he felt was not the hot, destructive thing that most men felt in this moment. It was not rage. It was closer to what he felt at the end of a particularly complex forensic audit, when all the transactions had been traced and all the numbers reconciled, and the total figure sat on the page with the absolute finality of arithmetic. A cold, almost physical recognition the number that could not be argued with, or the number that simply was. He opened his laptop. He created a new folder. He labeled it Project Lily. And he began. 8 months earlier, Ethan had noticed the first anomaly, not in his marriage. Those signs had been diffuse and gradual, the kind that accumulated the way water damage accumulated, invisible for months, structural in their consequences, only catastrophically apparent once the ceiling had already started coming down. The evening silences that filled with the wrong kind of quiet. The phone face down on every horizontal surface, as if proximity to its screen-up position would constitute some kind of confession. The small but persistent failures of intimacy, not the dramatic failures of open conflict, but the subtle ones, the moments of contact that stopped happening without announcement, the conversations that turned to logistics before they had a chance to become anything else. He'd categorized those as marriage problems, addressable, potentially, by the things you addressed marriage problems with. He'd considered suggesting they see someone. He'd prepared, more than once, a version of the conversation about what had been happening between them. He'd delayed it for reasons he could now identify as avoidance, though at the time he'd told himself they were patience. The first anomaly he'd noticed had been financial. Callaway Financial Group had been his for 12 years. But he'd built it from a 2-room office above a printing shop on Carlisle Avenue. The elevator in that building had never worked properly. The light in the stairwell had flickered on one side from his first day to his last, and the coffee from the shop on the ground floor had been reliably mediocre, but cheap, which had mattered in year 1. Into one of the region's more respected mid-market financial advisory and forensic accounting firms. 41 employees, 3 offices, a client list that included 2 regional banks, a pharmaceutical distributor, a property management group with commercial holdings across 4 counties, and a private equity firm that sent referrals with the reliable cadence of an entity that had found something that worked and saw no reason to change it. He'd built it by being very good at one specific thing, finding what people had hidden. Not in a confrontational way, not in the way of an investigator, but in the way of a reader, a man who understood numbers as language, who could look at the story a financial record told and identify where the narrative had been edited, where a sentence had been removed, where the grammar of money had been bent just far enough to be nearly invisible, but not far enough to be actually so. He'd spent a career developing that skill, refining it, trusting it the way a musician trusted an ear for pitch, not infallibly, but with a confidence built on years of being right more often than the probability should have allowed. Marcus Dray had come into CFG 6 years ago. Not as a partner initially, but as a senior advisor brought in because Ethan respected his grasp of corporate structuring, and because, this he admitted to himself now, with the unsentimental clarity of hindsight, he'd wanted a friend, with the specific loneliness of a man in his early 30s who had built something genuinely significant and had no one in his daily life who understood what that building actually felt like. Serena understood the outputs. She understood the money and the reputation and the social position. She didn't understand the texture of it, the weight of carrying other people's professional livelihoods in decisions you made at 7 in the morning before anyone else arrived. Marcus had understood, or had performed understanding with enough skill that for 6 years Ethan couldn't distinguish the one from the other. He'd made Marcus a partner 18 months ago, a 15% equity stake in CFG formalized in a partnership agreement drafted by his attorney, Claire Ewan, who had sat across from him in her conference room and listed the provisions she wanted included: a detailed buyout trigger for breach of fiduciary duty, a non-compete clause tied to specific client categories, as a non-solicitation agreement with financial teeth, and a provision requiring any significant financial misconduct to be treated as a triggering event activating compelled divestiture at a formula price defined as the lower of two independent appraisals under such circumstances. "He's my friend," Ethan had said. Claire had looked at him over her reading glasses with the expression she reserved for statements she found professionally inadvisable. She was a small woman in her early 50s, with gray-streaked hair she kept pulled back, always the same style, for as long as he'd known her. She wore her experience lightly, carried it mostly in the eyes. "He can be your friend, and also someone we structure carefully," she'd said. "Those aren't competing propositions." He'd agreed to most of it. The non-compete had been softened at his own request, because agreeing to the harder version had felt, in that conference room, like making a statement about Marcus that he hadn't been willing to make. Claire had noted his objection, revised the clause, and moved on. She was not a woman who expended energy on battles she couldn't win, in the moment when she could simply wait for them to become relevant later. 8 months ago, reviewing a quarterly reconciliation in his home office on a Saturday morning while Lily watched cartoons in the next room, he'd found the first discrepancy: $17,000. Bams, routed through an operational expense account under the categorization Client Entertainment and Development, at a timing that didn't align with any active client acquisition period he could identify, in an amount that, when cross-referenced against the actual entertainment expenditures logged that quarter in the firm's primary accounting system, produced a gap that had no documented explanation. Most people would have flagged it as a rounding error, a miscategorization, just the kind of minor discrepancy that audit adjustments existed to clean up. Ethan had spent his career knowing the difference between a discrepancy that was noise and one that was signal. The difference was almost never in the dollar amount. It was in the structure, in whether the irregularity had the random shape of an error or the deliberate shape of a decision. This had the shape of a decision. He'd started pulling threads. The financial systems at CFG were layered, as they were at any mid-sized firm: operational accounts, client billing structures, payroll, expense accounts, partner distribution accounts, a dedicated account for regulatory compliance reserves. Each layer had its own access controls and its own audit trail, and the audit trail was, in theory, complete and unmodifiable. In theory. What the audit trail didn't automatically flag was the pattern of behavior across layers when that behavior was consistent with legitimate activity in any individual instance. Each transaction, looked at alone, could be explained. Each categorization, examined in isolation, had a defensible rationale. The manipulation wasn't in any single record. It was in the cumulative structure, in the way 17 different individually plausible transactions added up to a design that was unmistakably intentional. By his 3rd month of pulling threads, the $17,000 had revealed itself as the visible edge of something that Petra Voss, the external forensic auditor he retained in month 4, would ultimately document at $412,000 over 18 months. Petra Voss operated out of a consulting firm with a deliberately unremarkable name in the financial district, 12 floors above a coffee shop that was open before dawn for the people in those offices who needed to be. She was 53, angular, with the calm of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the gap between what the documents said and what had actually happened was the only interesting question. Ethan had found her through a referral from a colleague he trusted. Had met with her for 45 minutes in a room she'd rented specifically for their meeting, had given her nothing about the personal context of what he was investigating. He'd paid her in cash from a personal account. He'd given her only the financial records, the access logs, and the categorization data. He'd said, "Find the design." She'd called him 3 weeks later. Her voice on the phone had the tone of a professional delivering findings rather than revelations, measured complete, stripped of editorial. "There are two parties with relevant access," she'd said. "One of them is a senior partner. The other is listed in your system as a consultant." She'd spelled out the name of the consultant's login credentials. Ethan had already known the name they'd spell. He'd just needed someone other than himself to document it. "I can have the full report to you in 10 days, she'd said. 47 pages. You'll want to have a corporate attorney present when you read it." "I'll read it alone first," he'd said. He had. He'd read it at his desk with a glass of water he didn't touch. The office silent except for the sound of the building settling, the pages going slowly, the numbers registering with the specific weight of confirmed things. When he'd finished, he'd sat in the quiet for a while. Then he'd opened a new document and started making notes about estate law. But he'd thought about the house first. The family home was held jointly, his name and Serena's on the deed, a standard ownership structure they'd established when they purchased the property 7 years ago, one that placed the property fully in the marital estate and subject to equitable distribution in any divorce proceeding. The home's current market value, based on comparable sales in the neighborhood, was slightly above $1.2 million, and it was the largest single asset in the marital estate by a significant margin. An equitable distribution proceeding would likely result in the court ordering either a sale with proceeds split or a buyout of one party's interest by the other. In either scenario, the practical outcome was that the family home, the house where Lily had grown up, the house where her bedroom had the sun clock and the curtains with the cartoon rabbits, and on the house whose entryway Ethan had stood in 10,000 times, was either divided or dissolved. Ethan had considered this problem with the same methodical attention he gave every problem, and he'd identified a solution that was not widely understood outside of estate planning practice, because it was, by its nature, something that worked best when no one was paying attention yet. An inter vivos transfer to an irrevocable trust. But the principle was straightforward. Property transferred into a validly structured, irrevocable trust ceased to be the personal property of the transferor and became an asset held in trust for the named beneficiary. If executed before any divorce proceeding was initiated, crucially, before there was any pending claim or litigation that would give rise to fraudulent conveyance exposure, such a transfer removed the property from the marital estate for equitable distribution purposes. Thus, the conditions for a clean transfer were specific. The transfer had to occur while the transferor was solvent. It had to be for a legitimate purpose, in this case, estate planning and the long-term financial security of a minor child. It had to be documented, appraised, and recorded properly, and it had to precede any divorce filing by a sufficient margin to establish that it wasn't a reactive transfer designed to defraud a spouse of their equitable interest. 6 weeks before he filed anything, Ethan had transferred the family home into the Lily Calloway Irrevocable Trust. He'd had the property appraised by a licensed independent appraiser. He'd engaged an estate attorney, not Claire, who did corporate and family law, a different attorney, was a specialist in trust and estate work named Gerald Ferris, who'd been doing this for 30 years and had the particular methodical quality of someone who had never once cut a corner because he'd seen what corner cutting produced. To draft the trust instrument. The trust named Lily as the sole beneficiary and Ethan's mother, Diane, as trustee. Gerald had walked him through every provision. The spendthrift clause, which prevented any creditor or adverse party from attaching the trust assets against the trustees' or beneficiaries' obligations. The anti-alienation clause. The no contest provision. The trust document was clean in the way that only 30 years of practice produced. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary, every provision tied to a specific protective function. The transfer was recorded 8 days after the trust instrument was executed. 2 days after the recording, Ethan had called Claire Ewan. The meeting with Claire had lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. She'd read the 3 folders in order: the forensic audit, the personal investigation timeline, the trust instrument. With the uninterruptible focus she brought to all documents, her reading glasses on, her notepad open beside the folders with the cap of her pen removed, though she didn't write anything until she finished reading. When she finished, she removed her glasses. She set them on the table. "The trust instrument," she said. "You had this done before consulting me." "I retained a specialist." "A specialist is appropriate for the instrument itself, but the strategy, transferring the marital home before filing for divorce, that's not just an estate transaction. That's a litigation move." "I know what it is," Ethan said. She looked at him for a moment. "Tell me the analysis." He told her. So the fraudulent conveyance exposure, the risk that a court would treat the transfer as an attempt to deprive Serena of her equitable interest, had 3 elements, all of which needed to be present for the challenge to succeed. First, the transferor needed to be insolvent at the time of transfer or rendered insolvent by it. Ethan was not insolvent. He had substantial liquid assets, an operating business, and no debt beyond the ordinary. Second, that there needed to be a pending or anticipated claim that the transfer was designed to frustrate. There had been no pending claim, and the transfer predated any filing by 6 weeks. Third, the court needed to find fraudulent intent, that the transfer was made specifically to defraud the spouse of a known entitlement. The documentation established a legitimate estate planning purpose, was thus confirmed by the attorney who'd drafted the instrument and whose notes on the client consultation, establishing that the stated purpose was long-term planning for a minor child, predated any initiation of divorce proceedings. "The timing is the key issue," Claire said. "The timing is the defense," Ethan said. 6 weeks before filing creates a margin that, combined with the solvency evidence and the documented planning purpose, this makes the fraudulent conveyance argument very difficult to sustain. Serena's attorney will make the argument. It will fail. How confident are you? In the legal analysis, very. In the execution, completely. The instrument is clean. Gerald Ferris's work doesn't have holes. Claire was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, she moved on to the next item without editorializing on the last, which was how she always moved, forward efficiently, and the relevant question ahead always more important than the completed one behind. The partner buyout. "The breach of fiduciary duty clause," Ethan said. "The forensic audit constitutes the documented predicate. The audit is prepared by a third-party expert meeting the qualifications specified in the agreement. The buyout price formula, applied against the restated financials reflecting the fraud losses, produces a compelled divestiture price that is substantially below what Marcus paid for the stake. He'll argue the restatement methodology. He can argue it. The methodology is Petra Voss's, and her methodology will hold up in any commercial court that reviews it. If he wants to contest it, he's contesting 47 pages of documented forensic analysis against whatever his attorney can construct in response, which will be, at best, a competing expert who produces an alternative analysis. And say, those disputes get resolved by judges who know which numbers have more documentation behind them. Claire turned to the second folder. The personal investigation. This is the affair documentation. Timeline and pattern evidence. Call record analysis, financial cross-referencing, physical location data from time-stamped documentation I obtained through legal means. It doesn't give me a hard start date, but it establishes a 20-month pattern of proximity and financial entanglement. In the divorce petition, I want to plead the financial fraud as the operative instrument in the asset distribution argument. The affair is context. I'm not leading with it. I'm not asking a judge to care about the moral dimension of it. I'm asking a judge to care about the financial dimension. The fact that marital resources were used in furtherance of a relationship that involved financial misconduct that harmed the marital estate. Claire considered this. That framing is better, she said. Courts care about money more consistently than they care about infidelity. I know. And custody. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Primary physical custody to me, he said. Good. On the basis of documented caregiving history, not on the basis of Serena's conduct, and not through anything that uses Lily to make a point. The evidence is the school records, the medical records, the pickup logs, the teacher communications, the 6 years of 2 stories every night. It's in the documentation because it actually happened. I was the primary caregiver. But the court will see that. You don't want to use the affair. I don't want to use anything that requires my daughter to understand someday that her custody arrangement was a weapon in a war. The caregiving record is the argument. It stands on its own. Claire looked at him for a long time after that. Longer than she typically looked at clients when she'd moved on to the next item. Give me the process server's contact, she said. The week before the filing, Ethan worked. And he worked with the particular intensity of a man who had converted an emotional situation into a project, who had taken grief and rage and the specific hollow feeling of an ending and directed them entirely into preparation. Every detail reviewed twice, every document verified, every timeline confirmed. He called the process server on a Monday. A man named Garrett, who'd been doing legal service in this jurisdiction for 22 years and who communicated in the clipped, an information-only register of a professional who'd learned early that the emotional texture of the documents he delivered was not his concern. He confirmed the addresses. He confirmed the timing. He confirmed the sequence, the civil fraud complaint and partnership petition to be filed and served simultaneously, the divorce petition to be filed separately and served at Serena's business address, not at the family home, not with Lily present, as not at a moment that turned into a scene with a child as witness. On the Thursday before the filing, he had dinner with his mother. Diane Calloway's house on the east side of town had the smell of his childhood. Black tea and wood polish and something always baking. Tonight, a spiced cake that had been cooling on the counter since before he'd arrived. She'd set the table properly, the way she always set it, with the napkins folded and the water in glasses rather than bottles. Was she? Because she believed that small formalities were a form of respect, and that respect was not something you switched off because the circumstances were hard. They ate together. They talked about Lily, about her marine biology phase, her current debate about crayon technique, the play she'd performed in last month where she'd announced the arrival of spring with the conviction of a child who took all her roles seriously. Besortum. They talked about everything except what they both knew was happening in 4 days, until Diane set down her fork and looked at him. Is she going to fight it hard? She asked. She meant the trust. She meant the house. Her attorney will challenge the transfer, he said. The challenge will fail. Gerald's work is clean, the timing is correct, and the court will find a legitimate planning purpose. Diane was quiet for a moment. And Lily? I've proposed primary physical custody to me. Significant time to Serena. I'm not trying to cut Serena out. Lily needs her mother. I'm not doing any of this in a way that makes Lily a casualty. Diane nodded slowly. You've been careful. About that specifically? Yes. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers for a moment. Brief, unsentimental, The gesture of a woman who expressed things precisely, without excess. Then she removed her hand and picked up her fork. "Come Thursday next week," she said. "Lily will want to tell you about whatever she does with me during the day. She told me this week she wants to bake something complicated." "I'll be here Thursday," he said. He drove home through the late evening streets with the particular quiet of a man who had made a decision and was on the other side of the making. Past the uncertainty, past the rehearsal of alternatives, into the clean space that decisions, when you finally committed to them, opened up. He was not at peace. His peace was not the right word. What he was resolved, and resolution was, in his experience, the more durable thing. The morning of the filing was a Tuesday in late autumn. The sky was the uniform gray of a sky that had decided something and wasn't announcing it yet. Ethan was awake before 5. He made coffee from the small Italian press in his home office, a birthday gift to himself 2 years ago. He purchased because the firm's breakroom machine was producing something beneath his standards of what coffee should be, and because small, consistent pleasures were the kind of thing you could control, and so you did. The coffee came out thin and strong and direct. He drank it at his window, watching the street below assemble itself into morning. Lily came to his doorway at 6:30 in her pajamas, hair in its sleep configuration, dragging the elephant. "Can I have breakfast?" she said. "You can," he said. He made her eggs, and cut the toast into triangles, and poured juice into the cup with the rabbit on it, and sat across from her while she ate with the methodical focus she brought to eating, as if it were a task that required her full attention, and she wanted to honor that. He watched her, while he thought about the 47-page report, and the $412,000, and the cedar cologne, and the specific moment in the conference room when Claire had set down her pen and looked at him and confirmed that every piece of what he'd built was sound. He thought about Lily saying, "Daddy," he always does 2 stories, to a guardian ad litem who'd asked her who tucked her in at night. She didn't know any of this was happening. She was eating eggs. She was 6. Serena came downstairs at 7:15, already dressed for her meeting. A clean, composed version of herself, the morning armor fully assembled. She moved through the kitchen efficiently, kissed Lily on the head, kissed Ethan on the cheek, mentioned she'd be back around 4. "Lily has a half day today," Ethan said. "I arranged for my mother to take her for the afternoon." Serena paused. "I didn't know about that. She's been asking to see her grandmother, and I made it happen." He said it neutrally, without edge, because edge was not required. "I'll see you tonight." She gathered her bag. She looked at him for a moment. A brief moment. The kind that might have been nothing or might have been the beginning of a question she decided not to ask. Then she left. The door closed. Ethan sat at the kitchen table listening to the house settle into silence. At 8:15, he put Lily in the car. She talked the entire drive, but covering 3 separate subjects she'd been saving since last night, and he listened to all of them with his full attention. The classmate conflict, the new development in the elephant's narrative life, the growing case for green as a primary color, because these were real things, the most real things available to him this morning, and he would not let the day reduce them. His mother was at the door when they pulled up. Lily ran inside immediately, already listing her plans. Diane stood in the doorway and looked at her son, and they exchanged the look of people who understood each other completely and had the long habit of not needing to say things aloud. "Thursday?" she said. "Thursday," he confirmed. He drove to the office. At 9:13, while Ethan sat at his desk reading a client report, Garrett served Marcus Dre the civil fraud complaint as he walked through CFG's entrance. Marcus had been in the middle of a conversation with one of the junior advisors. and had accepted the documents with the automatic reflex of a professional man being handed something professional, and had then stood in the lobby reading the cover page for 11 seconds. Garrett noted the time, as he always did, before his expression did the thing expressions did, when the gap between the expected and the actual opened too fast to manage. At 9:17, Garrett entered Serena's brand office on the 4th floor of a commercial building on the west side. He waited in the reception area while the front desk assistant located her. At 9:21, he served her the divorce petition. At 9:52, Marcus Dre appeared in Ethan's office doorway. He looked different in the way that people looked different when the performance had failed. Not collapsed entirely, not disheveled, but unmistakably damaged. The warmth running behind instead of ahead of the face it was supposed to animate. But he stepped inside and closed the door and stood there with the document in his hand. Ethan. His voice had its usual tone, but the foundations underneath it were not usual. Ethan looked up from the client report. Marcus, we need to talk about this. You should retain an attorney. Claire Ewan's office will be in contact about the partnership buyout timeline. As the civil complaint speaks for itself, the exhibits are complete. It's not what it looks like. I'm familiar with that response, Ethan said. In 20 years of forensic practice, I've heard it applied to every category of financial misconduct I've ever documented. It's the first thing people say when the documentation is comprehensive, and the only remaining option is to dispute the framing. The documentation here isn't vulnerable to framing disputes. 47 pages. Third-party expert. Methodologically sound. Marcus stood there. The warmth attempted one more cycle, a version of warmth that was specifically engineered for this kind of moment, the warmth of contrition, of brotherhood appealed to. And Ethan watched it run, and said nothing. Serena, Marcus started. Is being served this morning separately, Ethan said. This isn't a conversation I need to have. You need a lawyer, a good one. I would suggest not retaining anyone you've used for firm business. Now it's because those relationships will complicate their position. Marcus looked at him, really looked at him, possibly for the first time in their acquaintance, the performed version of looking having failed, leaving only the actual looking. There was something real in that look. Maybe regret. Maybe be only the specific recognition of a man who had underestimated someone he'd had years to measure correctly. We're done, Marcus, Ethan said. It was said without weight. It's without the emphasis of ceremony or the architecture of a scene. Just a statement, delivered as a statement. Marcus nodded once. He left. Ethan picked up the client report. Serena arrived at 6 that evening. He heard the car in the driveway, then the pause outside the door that lasted longer than usual. The pause of someone composing themselves, breathing, deciding the terms of entry. Yet when she came in, she stood in the entryway and looked at him, and her face had the quality of a face that had spent 7 hours running calculations and had arrived at a number that it didn't like. He'd arranged the room the way the room always looked. Same lights, same chair, his glass of water on the side table. He was not staging anything. There was food in the kitchen, soup from the place on Mercer that she'd always preferred, in the container it came in, on the counter. You filed this morning, she said. Yes. Without a conversation? Yes. She set her bag down. She crossed her arms, not defensively. It was a thinking posture with her, always had been. Ethan, we have a daughter together. I know we have a daughter, he said. Her name is Lily. She's 6. She likes elephants and is considering a career in marine biology, though last week she mentioned pastry work as an equally valid alternative. She requires 2 stories per night, and has done so for 2 years. Her favorite color is yellow, but green is making a legitimate case. She prefers her toast in triangles. He paused. I know my daughter. Serena looked at him for a moment. Then, you transferred the house 6 weeks ago into a trust. Lily's trust, properly executed, properly valued, properly recorded. Gerald Ferris drafted it. You're welcome to have your attorney review the instrument. The timing and documentation will withstand any fraudulent conveyance challenge. Her expression shifted. He watched the math land, the specific recognition of a person who was very capable at strategic thinking and who had just understood that the strategic ground had been prepared long before she knew a battle was coming. You've been planning this, she said. Yes. For how long? Long enough. The room was still. Outside, and headlights swept across the ceiling, the slow transit of a car moving down the street, there and then gone. I thought you wouldn't do this, she said. Her voice had changed. Lower. Stripped of the calculation. Older. Something that had less to do with strategy and more to do with the specific miscalculation she'd made about who he was. I thought because of Lily, I thought you'd stay, that you would. You thought I'd stay in this marriage to give our daughter a complete family, he said. Because you believed I was that kind of man. She said nothing. You were right that I'm that kind of man, but you misunderstood what it means to be that kind of man. Staying wasn't the answer. Teaching my daughter, every day of her formative life, that what we had was what a marriage was supposed to look like. That was the one thing I couldn't do. He stood up. He was slightly taller than she was, had always been. In the early years of their relationship, she'd said she liked that, and had said something about feeling anchored. He didn't think about that. The soup is from Mercer, he said. I'll be at my mother's tonight. He picked up the overnight bag from beside the couch, packed before dawn, quietly, while Lily slept, and he walked to the front door. Ethan, her voice cracked on the second syllable, just the edge of something breaking through. He stopped in the doorway, but he stood there for a moment with his hand on the frame and the weight of 12 years in the space behind him. The first apartment, the wedding in the small hall with too many flowers, Lily's birth and the particular terror and amplitude of that night, the Sunday mornings, the arguments that mattered and the arguments that didn't, the slow erosion he'd tried to read as something repairable. He gave it a moment. He was not a cold man, despite what the months of cold calculation might suggest. Yet he was a man who had learned to hold things precisely because imprecision, the sloppy grief that turned into sloppy decisions, was the thing he could not afford. He gave it a moment, then he walked out. The cold air was immediate and clean. He breathed it in. He got in the car. The proceedings moved at the pace that legal proceedings moved, measured, bureaucratic, occasionally interrupted by moments of sharp specificity. Serena's attorney, a competent family law practitioner named Holt, filed the expected challenges. The trust transfer challenge, fraudulent conveyance, inadequate consideration, improper intent, failed at the first hearing, the judge noting that the transfer predated any legal action by a sufficient margin, was properly documented, properly valued, and had a legitimate estate planning purpose supported by the drafting attorney's client file. The motion is denied, the judge said, and moved on without ceremony. The brand company dispute was more protracted. And Holt's argument that the company's current market value should govern its equitable distribution treatment regardless of seed capital origin had enough surface logic to require full briefing. Claire's 18-page response walked through the commingling analysis, the fraud damages claim, The equitable principle that a party could not receive full equitable distribution credit for assets built in part with proceeds of civil wrongdoing against the same marital estate. What the judge ordered the company into escrow pending resolution of the fraud claims. 3 months into the proceedings, Holt brought a global settlement offer. Serena would retain full ownership of the brand company, paying Ethan a lump sum representing 50% of its appraised clean value, approximately $214,000. Ethan would release his equitable distribution claim to the remaining company equity. Plus, he would also accept a negotiated share of the other liquid marital assets, distributed per the settlement schedule. The family home remained in trust. That was not negotiated. It was not on the table. Ethan took the settlement. The civil fraud action against Marcus resolved concurrently. 4 months of negotiation. Marcus's attorney's opening position gradually retreating as the expert comparison between Petra Voss's analysis and their competing accountants' analysis produced a gap that the court was unlikely to close in Marcus's favor. The settlement, $412,000 in restitution, structured over 18 months, plus legal fees, plus a signed acknowledgement of the findings in a non-disputable form. Marcus signed it in a conference room Ethan was not present in. Claire handled the signing. She texted Ethan a single word when it was done. Executed. He read the text standing in a parking garage between client meetings. He put his phone back in his pocket and walked to his car. The partnership buyout closed 2 weeks later. Marcus divested his 15% at 63 cents on the dollar against his original investment, per the formula triggered by the breach of fiduciary duty clause. Claire's clause. The clause Ethan had tried to soften. Yet he sent her a handwritten note after the buyout closed. It said, "You were right about the clause. That's the last time I'll say it in writing." She called him when she received it. He could hear, through the professional phone manner, that she was slightly amused. "Once in writing is sufficient," she said. Primary custody was awarded per the guardian ad litem's recommendation, one which had been substantially influenced by Lily's own responses during their 4 hours together, responses that documented, in the language of a 6-year-old, who had no idea she was providing evidence, the texture of her daily life with her father. The school pickups, the medical appointments, the 2 stories, the sun clock her father had helped her choose, the triangle toast. But the guardian ad litem's report had concluded with a single sentence that Ethan read 3 times when it arrived in the discovery file. The child's primary attachment and daily structure are most clearly centered on the paternal household, and the proposed custody arrangement is consistent with her stated routines and expressed preferences. Lily didn't know she'd said any of this. She'd talked to a woman in a comfortable office and been given coloring materials and asked questions she'd answered with the comprehensive honesty of a child who didn't yet know that some answers had consequences. She'd told the truth. That was all. The first month of co-parenting had the quality of a new system being implemented. Functional, occasionally awkward, learning the tolerance thresholds of its own design. But Ethan and Serena communicated through a co-parenting app that Claire had recommended, which logged everything and created automatic documentation of schedule compliance. He'd suggested it. Serena had agreed. Their exchanges were brief, informational, civil. Pickup times, schedule adjustments, school notes, medical updates. The specific texture of Lily's weeks passed back and forth between 2 people who had decided to be, above everything else, her parents. But Lily adapted the way children adapted. Not seamlessly, not without confusion, but with the resilience that children carried in them as a default setting. The capacity to absorb new configurations of the world and find within them what was consistent and what was safe. She asked questions when she had them, directly, in the manner of a child who had not yet learned that some questions were difficult. Ethan answered them in the language she could receive. He did not editorialize. He did not introduce complexity she hadn't asked for. He answered what she asked. "Why don't you and Mom live in the same house now?" she'd asked on the third week. "Because we decided that 2 separate houses worked better for our family," he'd said. "Some families live that way. It doesn't change who your family is." "Do you still like Mom?" Ethan had paused at that one. It was the question with the most hazards, and he'd known it was coming. And he'd prepared for it not with a script, but with a principle. The true answer, in language appropriate for 6. "I think your mom is a capable person who loves you very much," he'd said. "We're not the right people to be married to each other. But that part, loving you, that doesn't change for either of us." Lily had considered this with the grave, evaluative focus she brought to significant questions. "Okay," she'd said, and then, "Can we have the fish story tonight?" "Oh, the one with the library?" "Yes," he'd said. He'd made it 30 pages longer than the first telling. There was an afternoon in March when he took Lily to the zoo. He'd been planning it since the week after the divorce was finalized. Not as ceremony, not as anything that needed to be marked. Just a thing she'd wanted, expressed in a half-asleep murmur to her elephant on a night that now existed on the other side of everything that had happened, in part of the past, in the way that the past was just the present that had kept going. They went on a Tuesday morning, in the first real warmth of spring, when the light had started having depth again after the flat gray of winter, and the zoo was mostly quiet. School groups beginning to arrive by mid-morning, but the early hour was theirs. Lily wanted to see everything, in the specific order she'd decided upon during the car ride, which she presented to him as a formal itinerary, and he followed her from enclosure to enclosure, while she narrated each animal's attributes and likely emotional state with the confident authority of a future marine biologist or pastry chef who had been watching nature documentaries at a volume that suggested she considered them instructional. The elephants held her longest. She stood at the rail and watched them with a stillness that was unusual for her. It's the kind of stillness that meant she was genuinely absorbing something rather than simply passing through it. The elephants moved around each other with the particular ease of animals that communicated in frequencies humans couldn't access, their relationships internal and complete, and invisible to any observer who hadn't been watching for years. "They know each other very well," Lily said. "They do," Ethan said. "Elephants remember everything." "Is that good or bad?" He considered the question. "Well, I think it depends on what they remember." Lily nodded slowly, with the expression of someone noting a point for later consideration. They had lunch on a bench near the bird enclosure. Sandwiches from the zoo's cafe, dry bread, processed cheese, juice from a paper carton with a straw that Lily managed to bend at an angle that should have made drinking impossible, but didn't. It was the kind of lunch that existed in a category below what either of them usually ate and tasted precisely right for where they were. Lily ate her half. She leaned against his arm. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah." "Why don't foxes live at the zoo?" He looked down at her. "Probably because they do better in the wild. They're built for it. Like your story, the one with patience. You remembered." "I remember all your stories." She said this as a statement of fact, and not a compliment, the way she said things that were simply true. "Tell that one again sometime." "I will." A sparrow landed near their bench. It regarded them with the specific confidence of an animal that had long ago decided visitors were not threats, but might be resources, evaluated the situation, determined they had no accessible food, and departed with the pragmatic efficiency of a small bird that had better things to assess. Lily watched it go. "Daddy?" she said. Yeah. Can we get a fox?" He looked at her. "No. Why not?" "Some things work better when they're free to be exactly what they are," he said. "You put a fox in a house, and it's not a fox anymore. It's something smaller." Lily considered this in the deliberate way she considered things she was genuinely trying to understand. The warmth of the March sun was present, but restrained, the kind of warmth that was still earning its authority after a long winter. Around them, as the zoo's mid-morning sounds assembled themselves, the distant vocalizations of animals going about the business of being what they were, the low background frequency of the city beyond the fences, a child somewhere to the left laughing at something specific. "Okay," Lily said. And then, "I think the elephants are my favorite." "Yeah?" "They're quiet," she said, "but they remember everything." "That's a good combination." He looked at her. She was watching the middle distance, tracking something only she could see. A child's attention moving the way it moved, fluid and present and unanchored to what had already happened. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 2 weeks later, Lily was telling him a story about a crayon dispute at school, a classmate, a misunderstanding, the specific injustice of a sharing policy she found structurally flawed. And in the middle of it, without pause, without deliberation, she said, "So I was going to tell Dad later. I was going to tell you, but then—" and continued on into the rest of the story without registering what she'd just said. She didn't notice. Ethan noticed. He let the sentence continue without marking it, without the kind of response that would make her self-conscious about a word that had simply found its correct home. He listened to the rest of the story about the crayon. That night she asked for the fox story first. He told it in the longer version now, with additions he'd been making over the months. New details about the forest, new complications the fox navigated with patience and precision, new characters who underestimated him, and a recurring bluebird who appeared at decisive moments and said nothing useful but always appeared, which Lily found funny, and which had become, by repetition, the story's most requested element. He was halfway through inventing the fox's next move when Lily fell asleep. He sat in the dark room for a minute, and listening to her breathe. Then he got up, turned off the lamp, and walked to his office. He opened the laptop. He navigated to Project Lily, the folder he'd created 8 months ago in the dark, on the night of the cedar cologne and the half-asleep declaration, and the cold, complete recognition of a ledger reaching its final number. He opened the first document he'd ever put in that folder. Not the forensic audit, not the trust strategy, but the single-page note he'd written that first night. Was the facts as he'd understood them then. The pattern. The beginning of the plan. He read it the way you read a record of something that had already been completed. All the moving parts visible now, all the outcomes arrived at. He deleted it. He closed the laptop. He went to bed. In the morning, the coffee was strong. The eggs were right. The toast came out in perfect triangles. Lily appeared in the kitchen in her pajamas and climbed into her chair and looked at her plate. "Triangles," she said, and with the satisfied tone of a person whose standards had been met. "Triangles," he confirmed. He poured her juice. She started talking immediately. The dream, the blue bird, a new theory about the fox's biography that she wanted to share before she forgot it, the elephant possibly needing a name, the ongoing negotiation between yellow and green. He listened. The window above the kitchen sink showed the morning, an ordinary morning, the kind with no particular drama in it. The light just arriving over the roof lines of the houses on the street, doing what light did, unremarkably, in the specific and unhurried way of things that didn't need to announce themselves. He refilled his coffee. Lily said something that made herself laugh. He watched her laugh, and he said nothing. And that was enough.